Hi, and welcome to another vertical scale media video. Today, I want to talk about how to get cinematic footage, or close to it, out of your action camera, specifically the GoPro. 24 frames a second is the generally accepted frame rate for cinematic footage. Most Hollywood cinematic movies are shot in 24 frames a second, but if you know a little bit about video, 24 frames a second is only part of the equation. Generally, you want your shutter angle or shutter rate to be the doubled inverse, if I'm saying that properly, of the frame rate. So if you have 24 frames a second, you typically want to have 1/48th of a second for your shutter rate. But aside from that, there's lots and lots of videos on YouTube. You can look this kind of stuff up and get a better idea of how that part works. For now, we're going to accept the fact that 24 frames a second and 1/48th of a second is how to get realistic motion blur and the effect we're looking for. On the left-hand side, I have a neutral density 16 filter, which is 4 stops of light reduction. And I have ISO 100 and a shutter that is twice the inverse of the frame rate. So 24 frames a second and 1/48th of a second for the shutter speed. On the right-hand side, I have ISO and shutter as auto, letting it figure out what it needs to do itself for the conditions that we have outside for lighting. So as you play through this, you can see that there is realistic snowfall, and it looks like it's moving on the left-hand side through the frame. Where on the right-hand side, you can see the individual flakes as they pass by the camera. And that is because the shutter speed on there is extremely fast. Now, pause here, and you can see a couple flakes that's kind of floating in air on the right-hand side. We can kind of guess at what the shutter speed might be just based on the fact that we have 4 stops of light reduction on the other side. And we would assume that ISO would be 100 because of the bright conditions out. So knowing that the shutter speed on the right-hand side is 4 times faster than the left, we have 1/48th. So we're going to make the math simple here and go to 1/50th. So we got 1/50th, go to 1/100th, that's 1 more stop. 1/200th, that is 2 stops. 1/400, 3 stops, and 1/800th of a second is 4 stops. So with 4 stops of additional filtering, we have gone from a 1/48th of a second shutter speed, which imparts that natural motion blur, and we've gone to 1/800th of a second. As you can see from the snow video I just showed, having 24 frames a second is only part of the puzzle. You have to have the right shutter speed as well in order to make the motion blur look realistic. Because if we go outside with our GoPros at 24 frames a second and 1/48th shutter speed, even at the lowest ISO it can go to, ISO 100, it's going to be way too bright and we're going to overexpose everything. This is a very inexpensive neutral density filter kit for the GoPro. Comes with several filters. There's a UV and a circular polarizer in here as well, but that's not the subject today. It comes with this attachment piece that snaps onto the front of the GoPro. So here is the GoPro. If you're wondering what this thing is, this is a foam windscreen that greatly helps when you're outside, cutting down the wind noise coming into the GoPro. The link down below if you're curious about that. But this little cap right here snaps onto the front of the GoPro and allows you to screw on these little filters. So the filter kit comes with several neutral density filters. Neutral density filters are labeled as neutral density 4, 8, 16, and 32. And ND4 is a 2-stop reduction, and ND8 is a 3-stop reduction, 16 is a 4-stop reduction, and 32 is a 5-stop reduction. So every time that you cut the light down by a stop, you're cutting it in half. The next part, though, is actually setting the right settings on the camera to get a proper exposure. And let's go to the back of the camera, and I will show you how that part is done. So the first one I want to talk about here, we're going to go through some other settings first, and then we're going to dive into critical settings, but we're going to talk about white balance, sharp, and color. This is the scene. I've changed around my studio lighting a little bit to really overexpose this image so we can really play around with these settings on the camera here. But as you can see, I have resolution at 2.7K, 24 frames per second, and wide field of view. White balance, we're going to start with that one. That one's critical to set. Imagine if you're going through the woods and you duck into a spot in the woods and then come back out and there's bright snow. Your white balance could be thrown all out of whack on those settings. You could enter the woods and have everything look really cool and blue, and then come out into the snow and have the snow look yellow, or vice versa. That happens when the camera is set to auto white balance, and we don't want that. We want to fix our white balance at a proper temperature. 6,000 Kelvin is usually what is considered cloudy, and 55 is usually considered daylight. Now you need to kind of use your judgment on the type of lighting that you're in and set it appropriately. But what you don't want is auto, because the camera will continuously vary the different white balance settings and the different lighting that it encounters, and it makes it really difficult post-processing to add a color grade to it, add a LUT to it, because your white balance is all out of whack for every individual scene, not just every time you hit the record button. So fix that to a fixed setting and then deal with it in post if you need to. Sharpness is the next one to deal with here. We want that to be turned down to low. That's artificial digital sharpening, and it makes pictures look funky. Color profile. This also goes hand in hand with how you're going to color grade your footage. There's two options in that one. There's flat and there's GoPro. Flat makes it easier to color grade, but out of camera doesn't look all that great. GoPro adds a stylistic saturated RGB color spec to it, but it makes it really difficult in post to change the color grade later on. So I would recommend that you set this to flat and color grade appropriately after the fact. Now we're gonna get to the meat of this now. Having a shutter speed at 1/48th of a second is what we want to aim for, because our frame rate is 24 frames a second. So now we need to mess with ISO. And the best way to mess with ISO, and because we can't control aperture on these cameras, they're fixed at approximately f2.8. So the best way to mess with ISO is to set your ISO max to 6400, which is the highest the camera can do. The reason you want to do that is that you want to have the camera have all the range it possibly can in case you go into shadow areas, darker scenes, or you end up having the light go down just because it's starting to have it go into sunset and eventually darkness. So set that to max. That doesn't hurt anything. Very rarely will you ever be able to fix these both to the same rate. Now, one instance where you could fix it at the same rate, say you had ISO 200 for min and ISO 200 for max. Maybe you're coming down a tunnel or coming out of the trees and you have the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, and you don't want to overexpose that. You want to make it so that in the trees or wherever the tunnel that you're in, when you pop out into the sunlight is already properly exposed. In those cases, you would actually set this. But if you're just running and gunning and having your action camera just capture the footage, you're not going to have time to set up staging like that, verify your footage, and redo take after take to try to get it right. So in that case, ISO max 6400, give it the range it needs to play with. But now we're going to go for ISO min. This is the important part when it comes to getting good quality out of this at the frame rates we need. I really wish the GoPro had a histogram or had zebras, but it does not. So you can see here, this is way overexposed. This is probably what's going to happen to you if you set your camera to 1/48th of a second, frame rate 24, and your ISO is at 100 when you're outside in bright daylight. So in comes a neutral density filter. We're going to slap this on the front. This is the ND16, so we're losing 4 stops of light with this. And now you can see we can start to make out scenes behind us here through the GoPro. So it cut down 4 stops of light, allowing the GoPro not to overexpose everything. So going from 6400, we go to 3200. Scrolled too much there. 6400 to 3200, you can see the scene changed in the camera. Now if we go to 3200, 1600, it barely changed. You see that in the background there. Mainly, where's my finger at? Over here in this area, you can see that's 64, 32, 16, it gets a little bit darker over there still. So 1600 right now is where this is, or where it needs to be with this filter combination. But if we go down to 800, you notice the scene doesn't change now. That's how we know that the ISO that it's operating at now is 1600, because jumping down, we don't get a scene change. So we don't want that. We don't want the camera to work at ISO 800. That is way too high, and we're going to introduce noise and grain into the image. We want to get as low as possible We don't want to be at ISO 100 because that gives us no headroom in case the scene changes that we're in and we get either a reflection off of water, brighter conditions where we pop into snow or the sun comes out and we weren't expecting that. We want to try to get it so that at ISO 200 to 100 we have no change, meaning that the camera is happy with ISO 200 as the ISO it needs to be at for the given conditions. That gives us slightly more headroom by being able to go from 200 to 100 if we get brighter conditions without overexposing. So in order to go down to these and not have that, we need to change the filter that's on here. So we're going to take off ND16. And because we're in my studio, we're going to continue to drop this down with no filter on it right now. We're down at 800, 400, and you see the scenes changing each time. 200, scene changed again, and 100. It just barely changed. So up to 200, down to 100, we see right over here in this area again, we're getting a little bit of a change. So I'm going to take a different filter and put it on here now. We're not going to use the 16. We're going to use the ND4, which is 2 stops of light. They do make an ND2, but this kit did not come with that. Now, if you go up to 200, 400, 8. So 8 to 4, we see a big change. 4 to 2, we don't see a change. 4 to 2. So that means that with this filter combination and the lighting that we're at, the camera's going to operate at ISO 400. Ideally, we should be at ISO 200, where we don't see that change to the next one up. And you would, more than likely, outdoors. I just don't have a bright enough studio light to be able to maximize that in here. But hopefully you get the idea. What we're looking for is to get a filter on there with at 1/48th of a second for shutter speed and a frame rate of 24 frames a second. We can get ISO 200 to look the same as ISO 100 with a filter on it. And then we set the minimum. We would set the minimum at that point to ISO 100. That way we know that the camera is normally operating in the lighting conditions that we have at ISO 200, but has slightly more headroom to go to ISO 100 if it gets a little bit brighter while we're using the camera. Hopefully that made sense. If it doesn't, please leave some comments down below. I'll try to explain this in a different way. Let me know how you understood it, and I'll see if I can interpret. But really, it's just a matter of trying to find your filter combination and the lighting conditions that you're at so that the camera looks the same as ISO 100 and ISO 200. So there you have it. Hopefully that explained how to actually capture realistic motion blur in your GoPro. There's much more expensive filters out there if you want to get higher quality filters for your GoPro. If you happen to be a photographer like me, you could get step-down rings that adapt larger filters down to this and use some of the filters you may already own for other parts. That's also a pretty viable option. Start out with this kit. It provides this little snap-on housing that you need to be able to put filters on, and then just buy a step-down ring to be able to use other standardized filters on this. Or you could buy a higher quality filter right off the bat. That is entirely up to you. But it's a good kit to get things going, and for the most part, you can color correct some of those color casting issues that the filters have when you're running on the GoPro. So thank you for watching. If you like this content, please subscribe to the channel. Every subscription really helps. I really appreciate that. Like and share. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other questions or thoughts on this topic, and hopefully we will be bringing more great content to you soon. Until then, have a good day. I can't stop tapping today while I'm talking. It's generally accepted that most cinematic again. Alright, like, I don't know, take 17. This is probably the most inexpensive piece of gear to do this with. This is the newer ND filter kit. That was annoying, that was my cell phone.